Hi, my name is Dave. I'm your host. You're listening to The Last Podcast, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you're returning, welcome back. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you continue to find tips, ideas, and value from listening to this podcast. If you were here last week and you listened to the first podcast that I had on Wednesday, we talked about anchors and the hidden things that we tie ourselves to for stability. We asked a question, or rather I asked a question: what is your life anchored to? Because when the storms hit, whatever you're anchored to gets revealed. We also talked about identity and how sometimes our identities become our anchors. And it really may sound safe, but whatever your identity is tied to it, especially if it's tied to something fragile like a role, a person, approval, success, or even survival patterns. And when that happens and your anchor or your life gets shaken or something gets taken away, it can feel like you're really losing yourself. This week, I want to tell you Serena's story. And if I have enough time, I'll tell you a little bit of mine. I'm trying to set the stage on what you'll learn in the beginning of Lasting Change Workbook, because this isn't about motivational theory. It's lived experience, tested in real pressure, and meant to help you recognize what's holding you up and what's quietly pulling you down. Serena, she was 42 years old, and by most appearances, she was doing fine. She had a great job, she had a clean, organized apartment, and a small circle of friends who admired her strength, and a calendar full of obligations she never missed. She woke up early, she worked late, and basically she smiled whenever, the time allowed her to, or when someone was nice to her or something like that. She kept it moving, and one of those things that caught me was keep it moving. And that's exactly what so many of us do, right? We wake up, we go about our lives, we go about our daily routines, and we keep it moving. But on Tuesday evening in November, she was sitting alone in her car in the parking garage of the office building where she worked, and she couldn't move. Her hands were on a steering wheel gripped, and the engine was turned off. She not only gripped the steering wheel tightly, she couldn't understand why she couldn't muster up the courage to turn the key in the ignition. Now, I want you to think about that. She sat there in the car with her hands on the steering wheel, and there was something in her that just made her pause and made her sit there, and she could not explain why she couldn't make herself go home, start the car and go home. The thoughts were like going to her house or her apartment. The silence she thought about, the familiar walls, the version of herself that waited for her there felt unbearable in a way she had no language for. She'd been there before. We're not talking about the parking garage. We're talking about that feeling that she felt at that moment. This specific hollow exhaustion had nothing to do with being tired. This sense that she was performing a life rather than living one. She had felt the same way at 30. And guess what? She pushed through it. And at 36, she felt the same feeling. And again, she pushed through it. Each time she had mistaken momentum for healing. Each time she had that feeling return, it became older and heavier and more insistent. What Serena did not know yet was that she was not falling apart. She was finally stopping long enough to feel what had always been there. She had learned early that feelings were liabilities. Her mother had not been cruel, not intentionally, but she had met and been very efficient. She had tears. That was met with redirection. Fear. That was met with practical solution. And grief, when her father left the family when Serena was 9 years old, that was met with silence and a new school year. And the quiet understanding that they were moving on now. Serena had absorbed that lesson real good. And the way that all children absorb everything completely. She filed that deep in the index of her mind under the heading, "This is how strong people operate." By the time she was a teenager, her filing system was well established. And we'll get into that later into this workbook when we talk about the filing system in our minds. When she was humiliated by a group of girls in the 8th grade, she filed that. When the boy she trusted violated that trust at 16, she filed that. When she graduated out of high school with honors, her mother said, "Good," instead of saying, "I'm proud of you." She filed that too. She became an expert at converting pain into productivity. Every wound became fuel. Every rejection became motivation. She built a life on a stored energy of everything that she had refused to feel, and it had worked for a long time, and it worked beautifully until it didn't. The filing system she had kind of reached capacity. Everything that she was holding on to, everything she was burying, everything she kept shoveling dirt over, it started to come to the surface. It started to leak, so to speak, not in dramatic ways, but in a quiet seepage. She would cry in the shower, reasons she couldn't name. She would feel a sudden suffocating loneliness in the middle of the room full of people. She would lie awake at 3 a.m. with this persistent sense that she had misunderstood something fundamental about her own life, but she couldn't locate it. She couldn't put a finger on it. She couldn't figure out what it was. She tried the things that normal people try. She had exercised more consistently. She had read self-help books. She underlined the sentences of books of things that felt true for her. She had attended a weekend workshop on living your best life and left with a vision board and a burst of enthusiasm that lasted 11 days. She had even tried therapy for a few months, but had found herself performing well in the sessions, the same way she always performed at everything else. Oh, let me tell you this. What Serena had never done was stop. Not truly stop and sit with the question she had been running from since she was 9 years old. Standing in the doorway of her parents' bedroom, watching her mother pack her father's things into boxes with a focused expression of someone completing a task. The question she had never been allowed to ask. The question that had shaped every relationship she ever had been in. Every boundary had she failed and hold, and every time she had made herself smaller to avoid being left behind. The question was not complicated. It was just 5 simple words. Am I worth staying for? Serena did not know that every pattern in her adult life, the overachievement, the self-sufficiency weaponized into isolation, the relationships she abandoned before they can abandon her, the way she helped everyone and asked for nothing, was the answer of her life that was built around that unasked question. Am I worth staying? She did not know that exhaustion she felt in the parking garage was not weakness. It was the weight of a belief that she's been carrying since childhood, since 9 years old, a belief that's been there, but never examined, never been named, and therefore had never been challenged. She did not know that the crack she felt opening inside of her was not the beginning of her collapse. It was the beginning of her excavation. I'm going to tell you quickly my story. I tell you Serena's story first because I want you to recognize something before I tell you my own. The battle within doesn't always announce itself with crisis. Sometimes it whispers for years before it roars. Sometimes it looks exactly like strength. Sometimes it looks like the life that appears from the outside to be a very functioning life. Mine looked that way for a long time too. The first crack in my foundation began when I was 20 years old. Though I didn't recognize it as a crack at that time, I didn't even know what it was, I couldn't even name it, but only in hindsight I see and I tell you that that crack happened when I was 20 years old. I believed that strength was moving forward without hesitation. I believed maturity meant suppressing emotion. I believed life would bend around my own will had I pushed hard enough. I was young, I was confident, and I was unaware that foundations can fracture long before the building collapses. A week before my father was killed, I argued with him. It wasn't like some extraordinary argument. There was no dramatic declarations, no final statements that felt prophetic. It was the kind of argument that happens when pride meets pride, and neither side is willing to bend. Words were spoken that could have been softened, but they weren't. I walked away irritated, justified in my position, assuming there would be time to circle back and repair what has been strained. I didn't know that then, but that time was never granted to us. A few days later, after the argument with my father, while I was in a store going about an ordinary errand, a man approached me, and in the store it was like the lighting was indifferent. It was the kind that makes everything look the same, so to speak. He took and looked at me directly in my eyes and said, "One day, someone is going to kill your father." There was no laughter in his voice, no sign of anger, no sign of humor, no hint that he was exaggerating. He spoke plainly and walked away. Now, at 20 years old, I was an atheist. I did not believe in spiritual warnings, divine intervention, or prophetic messages. I believed in coincidence or human conflict. I dismissed the statement as strange, unsettling, but ultimately irrelevant because my father had that effect on people. It did not occur to me to tell anyone. It did not occur to me that I had just been handed a sentence that would echo through the rest of my life. The following week, that same man murdered my father. When I received the news, my reality was fractured. The mind does not know how to process information that feels impossible and inevitable at the same time. Grief rushed in first, sharp and disorienting, but guilt followed closely behind. The argument replayed itself repeatedly in my head. The tone of my voice, the stubbornness in my posture, the unfinished nature at our last exchange. Questions rose with no clear answers. Should I have said something when that man approached me? Should I have warned my father? Had my silence contributed to his death in any way? The human brain searches for causality in tragedy because causality provides an illusion of control. I could have done something differently. Perhaps the world might make a little more sense. But there was no clarity, only repetition. Grief is heavy, but guilt is heavier. And at 20 years old, I had no framework to carry neither one of those. Instead, I started processing that weight. No, I buried it. I buried the confusion beneath the distraction. I buried the guilt beneath pride. I buried the vulnerability beneath anger. I did not understand that unprocessed trauma does not disappear. It embeds itself beneath the surface and quietly alters how we interpret life. Something shifted inside me. After my father's death, my sense of safety diminished. My sense of control weakened. The world no longer felt predictable. If something that violent and senseless could happen without warning, then stability itself was fragile. Anger became my armor. It felt stronger than sadness. It felt more controllable than fear. What I did not recognize was that the anger was not strength. It was a protective covering for the fracture. The second crack formed with the passing of my grandmother, the woman who raised me. She had endured the years when I was a teenager trying to become a man without understanding what manhood required. I wanted freedom without responsibility. I wanted independence without accountability. I experimented, rebelled, and made her life more difficult than she deserved. She absorbed my immaturity while continued to love me unconditional. When she passed away, the grief it was kind of different than my father's. It wasn't sudden and violent. It was reflective and heavy. It forced me to look backward instead of outward. Although I had the opportunity to apologize for the strain I placed on her life, my apology felt insufficient. It felt too small compared to the years she gave me. Regret lingered quietly in places I did not. Oh my goodness. As I'm telling you this story, it is like, I am so sorry, but that's kind of moving to me. I had so much regret. I couldn't and did not know how to examine it. And that was another fracture beneath the surface. Life continued as I always start moving on, and I do apologize. I remained steadfast in my ways back then, and I remarried and began attending church. My worldview began shifting, though I did not yet fully understand what that shift required of me. Over time, I repaired my relationship with my sister, and it's been 4 years since me and my sister had talked. That reconciliation did not happen overnight. It required humility on my part. It required patience on hers and a willingness to confront my own pride. Eventually, we became close again. Our bond became one of the strongest anchors in my life, and it felt as though something broken had been restored. Then the losses began to stack in ways I could not have predicted. My stepbrother passed away. Both my uncles followed them. A year after that, my sister and my aunt died. Each loss was its own event, but together they formed a pattern of erosion. Just as I began to stabilize, 2.5 years later, my wife of 26 years passed. And then months after her, my stepson passed. By then, grief was no longer episodic. It was atmospheric. It filled every space of my life. The house was different. Silence became presence rather than the absence. Familiar routines dissolved. The chair she once sat in was no longer occupied. The conversations that once structured my evenings no longer existed. I woke up and for a brief moment forgot, only to remember again within seconds. Each rationalization, I felt like reopening the wound. By the time I reached 60, the foundation of my life was no longer cracked. It was shattered. The identities I had carried for decades were gone. Husband, brother, protector, provider. The roles that once gave structure to my days had been removed one by one. Without them, I did not know who remained. I felt disoriented, angry, exhausted. Depression settled in gradually, not as an emotion exploration, but it was a steady dimming light. I lost interest in the things that mattered once. My energy declined. My thoughts became increasingly self-critical. I began interpreting loss as evidence that my usefulness had expired. The internal dialogue shifted from grief to accusation. You should have done more. I failed them. You are alone now, and now it's too late. Suicidal thoughts did not arrive as dramatic impulses. They arrived quietly, disguised as something that's reasoning. The mind began presenting conclusions rather than emotions. You have endured enough. There is nothing left to build. No one would blame you. You're tired now. That frightened me more than rage itself. Rage is loud and obvious. Emptiness is subtle and persuasive. The battle was not only emotional or psychologically, it felt amplified as though something dark pressed against my weakest moments. The mind became a courtroom where every past mistake was reintroduced. Evidence against my future. Guilt of my father's resurfaced. Regret regarding my grandmother resurfaced. Failures I thought that were long buried resurfaced. It felt as if the totality of my life was being used to argue against the right to continue to live. And yet, even at the lowest point, there was something left. 1%. A thin resistance I could not explain. A thread of light that did not come or originate from my own strength. In the quiet, of one of those darkest moments, a spark. I spoke a prayer I never thought I would say with so much sincerity. I asked God to forgive me, to rebuild what was broken, and give me purpose to what felt like rubble, the ruins of my life. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't polished. It was desperate. But that desperation marked the beginning of a shift. It did not wake up. The next day I didn't feel transformed. The depression wasn't instantly gone. The grief didn't evaporate, but something subtle had changed. The battle was no longer being fought alone. You see, I asked for help. Serena is a fictional composite story. She is built from the patterns I've seen across many lives, clients, colleagues, people that sat across from me and described their exhaustion in different words though, but in the same eyes, in the same manner. She's not only one person, she is in many ways every person who has ever decided to stop running and start looking inward. My story, however, is real. It's as real as they come. Every loss, every fracture, every moment of that courtroom in my own mind, that is my life. And I offer it to you, not for sympathy, but as evidence that the battle within does not disqualify you, evidence that cracks can precede construction, evidence that even when you cannot see the 1% of hope remaining, it's still there. What Serena and I have in common, and what you may recognize in yourself, is this. We had both been living from a fractured foundation for years without knowing it. We had both mistaken survival for wholeness. We had both built identities on top of unexamined wounds and then wondered why even the best efforts that we put forth wouldn't last with change. The wounds were not the problem. The wounds happened to everyone. The problem was that we never been excavated. We never dug deep into our own psyche and our own problems and in our own past to look at what might be driving us. We've never named it. We never brought it into light, and we could never see it clearly to address it honestly. That's what this book is for. The book will help you, not to make you feel worse about your past, not to reduce your pain, but to give you perhaps for the first time in your life, a structure, a compassionate way to walk through the terrain of your own life from childhood forward and begin to understand, to rebuild the foundation rather than just redecorate the surface. Before we begin that excavation work in the chapters ahead, I want you to think about something. I'm not going to ask you to do anything unfamiliar. I want you to slow down right now. Now is the time where I just want you to breathe and acknowledge something. If you want to work with me in going back and rebuilding your foundation, you're here. That alone means something. You're still alive. You're still moving forward. Whatever brought you to this podcast, the pain, curiosity, depression, hope, or something of the combination of them all, the fact that you're here means that you've not given up on life. You've not given up on yourself. It means some part of you still believe that change is possible. Hold on to that. We're going to build the foundation together. My name is Dave. You're listening to the last podcast, and I don't want you to miss what's coming up next. I said that this in last week, I said this was the beginning of a 3-part series. We actually extended that series to 5 parts. So don't miss next week, part 3. That's where we start to build real traction. You'll learn a self-forgiveness process that ends self-condemnation without excusing the past, and we'll walk through how to replace foundational beliefs that keep producing the same patterns. If you want real change and a change that lasts, don't skip this one. Next week is going to be awesome. We're not decorating, y'all. We're going to start rebuilding. Hey, my name is Dave. You're listening to the last podcast. I want to make this promise to you. If you do this work, I guarantee you that you're going to start the excavation on your life. whatever has been running your life, and forgive what needs to be forgiven, and rebuild your foundation so that change can actually last. Hey, again, my name is Dave. You're listening to the last podcast. Do me one favor. Go ahead and subscribe, and do me another favor. Like this podcast. I really appreciate you. Hey, come back on Friday. That's when we have Poetry Friday. My name is Dave. I wish you and your family receive all the blessings that you can handle. In the name of Jesus, amen.